She was 20 years old when they put her on the auction platform in Savannah. Bare feet on hot boards, wrists bound, a coarse gray dress sticking to her shoulders in the June heat. And the strangest thing about her was not that she smiled. It was that she looked like she was counting, not coins, not bids, men. The auctioneer called her quiet, tractable, a steady house and field girl with no trouble in her. But Naomi Reed was not listening to the price. She was watching the buyers. The planter who kept touching the folded paper in his coat, the overseer with fresh bruises across his knuckles, the trader who laughed too quickly whenever debt was mentioned, the gentleman near the back who never raised his voice, because men with money rarely need to. They looked at Naomi and saw a body. Naomi looked back and saw a system, and the system had cracks. Her name in this composite account drawn from the documented realities of enslaved resistance was Naomi Reed. And by the time the man with the folded paper bought her, she had already begun to take him apart. To understand what Naomi became, you have to understand what slavery trained her to notice. She was born in 1824 on a worn-out cotton place outside Augusta, Georgia, in a cabin where the roof leaked over the sleeping pallets and the walls held heat in summer like a closed fist. Her mother, Ruth, worked in the yard, the kitchen, and wherever else the mistress pointed. Ruth could not write her name where anyone could see it. But she could read weather in a line of ants. She could read danger in the way a white woman set down a teacup. She could read a household by the sounds it made before breakfast. Her father, Abram, drove wagons between farms and river landings. That meant he heard things: prices, names, routes, arguments. Men who thought the enslaved driver on the wagon seat was no more important than the reins in his hands would say anything in front of him. Abram remembered everything. Then he taught Naomi to remember too. Never stare, he told her. Never ask twice. Never let them know which part you heard. And never waste a fact. That lesson became the spine of her life. By 12, Naomi could tell which overseer had been drinking by the angle of his hat. By 14, she knew which merchants extended credit and which planters were already sinking under it. By 16, she could hear the difference between a threat meant for performance and a threat that would turn into blood before sundown. She learned letters from a half-burned primer Ruth had hidden behind loose chinking in the cabin wall. Not enough to read like a schoolgirl. Enough to recognize names. Enough to follow numbers. Enough to understand that ledgers, bills of sale, and field tallies were not just paper. They were the white world talking to itself. And because that world refused to believe she could understand it, it kept leaving its throat exposed. Then came the winter sale. The owner died first. After that came the creditors. Men with gloves and measuring eyes moved through the cabins and barns and smokehouse with the same face, whether they were counting barrels, mules, or people. Naomi watched her father sold downriver. Her mother was taken 3 days later. No prayer made it stop. No crying changed a number in a ledger. When Ruth was pulled toward the wagon, she did not scream. She looked at Naomi once, long enough to give her daughter the only inheritance she still owned. A look that said, live, not survive. Live. For 18 months, Naomi was held on a smaller place while the estate was cut into pieces. Then, in June of 1844, she was brought to Savannah and stood on the block. That was where Silas Bramwell bought her. Bramwell owned 600 acres of cotton land near the Ogeechee, respectable enough to be invited to dinners, unstable enough to sweat through them. He was 48, narrow-faced, careful with his cuffs, and more frightened of appearing poor than of being cruel. Men like Bramwell needed the world to believe they were orderly. Naomi learned in 3 days that his plantation was not orderly. It was held together with punishment, credit, and lies. The senior overseer, Elias Venn, ruled the fields with the bored viciousness of a man who had turned pain into a habit. He kept 2 sets of numbers, one for Bramwell, one for himself. Cotton weights changed between the gin house and the ledger. Supply orders arrived light. Cornmeal went missing. Whipping became explanation. Venn thought the enslaved people feared him too much to notice. He was right about the fear, wrong about the noticing. Naomi began the way she always began, by becoming less visible. She carried water without spilling, lowered her eyes without closing them, answered questions slowly enough to seem simple and clearly enough to avoid correction. Inside the house, she learned the rhythm of the rooms, where Bramwell kept the plantation books, which drawer stuck in damp weather, which key the housekeeper wore on a blue ribbon, which evenings Bramwell drank after letters from Savannah, which Sundays Venn came to the back gallery to collect his pay, smelling of tobacco and sour whiskey, smiling like a man who believed the ground under him belonged to him. Naomi never took a page. That would have made a missing page. She read what she could. She counted the columns. She memorized the mismatches. A bale marked 480 pounds in one place became 520 in another. A barrel of molasses listed for the quarters never reached them. A tool repair charged twice. A wagon fee paid to a cousin who had not driven a wagon in 6 months. By harvest, Naomi had enough to hurt him. But hurting Venn was not the point. Timing was the point. The opening came at dinner. Bramwell's factor from Savannah arrived with a clean coat, a cold smile, and the kind of patience creditors have when they know patience is about to become ownership. Naomi served the table. She heard the factor mention missing weight. She saw Bramwell's left hand close on the stem of his glass. She saw Venn shift in the doorway. That night, Naomi passed 6 numbers through 4 people. A laundress, a hired carpenter, a free black boatman who brought nails from the landing, a clerk who liked to appear useful to important white men. No one carried the whole story. No one knew where it began. 2 weeks later, Bramwell opened his books in front of the factor. By sunset, Elias Venn was gone. Not dead, not redeemed, not punished by justice. Dismissed, disgraced. Turned loose into the same planter world where a reputation for stealing from white men could follow a man farther than any whipping scar. Naomi watched him leave from behind the kitchen door. She felt no triumph, only confirmation. A system built on cruelty could still panic over arithmetic, and panic created doors. Bramwell sold 8 people that winter to cover obligations he called temporary. Naomi was among them. Her next owner was Orrin Pike, a rice planter outside Darien, where the land turned flat and wet and the air smelled of mud, salt, and rot. Pike was polished in a way Bramwell had never managed. He owned books in Latin. He quoted scripture over breakfast. He called himself a humane master because he preferred methodical control to public rage. His plantation used tidal fields, trunks, ditches, gates, and labor so technical that the white men congratulating themselves on management barely understood the thing making them rich. The rice did not grow because Pike was wise. It grew because enslaved people knew water. They knew when to let it in, when to hold it, when to starve it. When a small mistake in timing could ruin a field that looked perfectly fine to a gentleman standing dry on a bank. Naomi had not grown up in rice, so she listened. She listened to an older woman named Keziah, who could look at a ditch and tell from the skin of the water whether the gate had been opened too long. She listened to 2 brothers who repaired trunks at night because the overseer did not know enough to repair what he had ordered broken. She listened to men whose grandparents had carried rice knowledge across oceans and survived a world that tried to turn knowledge into property without admitting where that knowledge lived. Pike did not see any of this. He saw hands. He saw tasks. He saw yield. Naomi saw dependency. And dependency was another crack. Pike's weakness was not theft, it was reputation. He sold rice as a better grade than it was. Not once. Not by accident. As practice. The broker in Savannah accepted it because Pike moved carefully, and because everyone in that world tolerated small lies, as long as the lies did not embarrass powerful men. Naomi understood that embarrassment mattered more than sin, so she stored the truth. Not on paper, never paper, in her mind. In the winter of 1846, Pike sold Keziah's eldest son, Ben, to a planter in Louisiana. Ben was not the only man who understood the trunks. But he was the man who understood the western field, where saltwater tried to creep in under high tide. Pike saw age, price, and debt. He did not see that he was selling the memory that held one section of his land together. The next season, the water went wrong, not all at once. That was what made it powerful. A gate opened late. A repair failed because the wrong wood had been used. One field soured, another came up thin. Pike blamed laziness. The overseer increased punishment. Work slowed because pain slows hands. Then the broker received a quiet warning that the rice grades from Pike's place might not survive close inspection. The warning moved through a market woman, a dockhand, and a letter written by someone whose handwriting Pike could not know. By August, Pike's name was being discussed in rooms where he was not invited. By September, his neighbors were careful with him. By October, the man who had built his life on appearing honorable was being watched every time a barrel left his landing. Naomi poured coffee while Pike tried to explain himself to two visitors. His voice was calm. His collar was damp. That was how she learned another rule. Some men could endure accusation. They could not endure being seen as smaller than the story they told about themselves. Pike reduced costs. Pike sold people. Naomi moved again. By now, fragments of her had begun moving where she could not follow. Not her name. Names were dangerous, but a shape. A woman sold from one place to another, quiet, young, too still. Plantations that looked solid before she arrived, then developed troubles after she left. An overseer exposed, a planter shamed, a rice crop failing right when the books began to burn him. The Whisper Network did what it had always done. It carried partial truth because partial truth was safer than full truth. In the quarters, in wash yards, at landings, between hired hands and drivers, and women trading vegetables at the edge of market days, a phrase began to move, the counting girl. Not because she counted coins, because she counted what white men forgot to hide. Naomi did not know how far the phrase had traveled. She would have distrusted it if she had. Legends get people careless. She had survived by refusing to be larger than the room allowed. Her third sale took her inland to a tobacco place owned by Gideon Rusk, a man who punished like he was trying to silence a sound only he could hear. Rusk was not merely cruel, he was nervous. That made him worse. Cruelty with confidence has patterns. Cruelty with fear invents new ones. Naomi saw the fear inside the first week. Rusk inspected locks twice, asked about conversations that had not been reported, opened letters in private, then burned them, then stirred the ashes. He owed money in Macon, in Charleston, and in a bank whose name he never said aloud unless he thought the room was empty. On Rusk's place, Naomi met a man named Isaiah Bell. He was 30 or close to it, though grief had put years around his eyes. He had once been free in Pennsylvania. He had worked as a cooper, earned wages, signed his name, bought cloth with money no one had handed him as an allowance. Then he had been seized under a false claim and sold south through a chain of paperwork that made theft look official. Isaiah could write. Naomi did not trust him quickly. Trust was not a feeling to her. It was a structure. She tested small things. A warning about a patrol. A message that moved correctly. A silence kept when silence had a cost. Isaiah passed. After 4 months, Naomi told him enough to make his eyes sharpen. Not everything. Never everything. Enough. Together they made a weapon the white world respected because it looked like the white world. A business letter. No pleading, no righteous thunder. Just dates, amounts, accounts, names, and the thin, formal language of men who believed ink was more serious than blood. Isaiah wrote it in a hand, steady enough to pass through office doors. Naomi supplied what Rusk had let fall in scraps. A shipment pledged twice. Land used as collateral after it had already been promised. Cotton receipts moved to cover tobacco loss. A note due in March. Another already overdue. The letter traveled through a black wagoner, then a church contact, then a white clerk who thought he was serving his employer by opening the morning mail. The bank did not move fast. Institutions rarely do when they are not protecting the powerless. But they moved, and once they looked, they found more than Naomi had given them. By late 1848, Gideon Rusk was no longer a man avoiding ruin. He was a man inside it. Creditors came. Neighbors visited with sympathy sharpened into appetite. People were sold as if a shattered plantation could be swept clean by breaking more lives apart. In that confusion, Isaiah disappeared. Not in a storybook escape, no dramatic horse, no moonlit speech. He was assigned to load barrels near the road. A wagon left. A hired hand changed direction. Someone shouted about missing inventory. By the time Rusk's men understood, the missing inventory had a name. Isaiah Bell was gone. Naomi never learned with certainty where he landed. But months later, a message came back through 3 hands. 2 words. He crossed. Naomi kept those words where she kept her mother's last look, not as comfort, as proof. By 1849, Naomi had stopped thinking only about single men. An overseer could be removed, a planter could be embarrassed, a creditor could be directed toward a lie. But the machine survived because it was bigger than any one person. So she began to work where the machine depended on silence. Movement, routes, timing, safe names, unsafe names, ferry crossings, patrol habits. Which white men were greedy enough to bribe, which were frightened enough to avoid, which free black families could help once and never again, which churches had a side door, which road looked shorter but carried dogs, which swamp looked deadly but hid a path if you knew where the roots rose. She gathered knowledge the way other people gather seed, slowly, with the future in mind. When she was sold again to a larger plantation near the Savannah River owned by Malcolm Sutter, the danger changed. Sutter was perceptive. He was the first owner who seemed to understand that enslaved people had interior lives not because he honored those lives, but because he feared what interior life might do. He watched the quarters, watched funerals, watched who stood beside whom. He listened too closely when women sang. He asked questions that sounded casual until you realized there was a hook underneath them. Naomi felt his attention settle on her within a month. So she changed shape. She did less. Spoke less. Let others carry words she had never touched. Worked through relationships too ordinary to look like a network. Laundry, births, food, sickness, borrowed thread, a repaired shoe. A warning folded into the way one woman returned a borrowed pot. Between 1849 and 1852, people began leaving plantations across a stretch of river country in patterns no planter could map. 2 sisters during a debt auction. A mother and child during a county court week. 3 men after a fever outbreak turned patrol schedules irregular. An older carpenter who vanished after a bridge washed out and left half the district arguing over who should pay for repair. Not every disruption was made. Some were discovered. Naomi had learned not to worship control. Control was for men like Sutter, who believed the world should hold still under their hands. Naomi worked with openings, a financial panic, a lawsuit, a rumor, a storm, a funeral that gathered people across property lines, a quarrel between overseers. When a crisis appeared, she asked one question: can someone move through this? By her private count, more than 30 had moved through openings she helped shape before Sutter brought in a man named Caleb Holt. Holt was not an overseer. He was worse. He made a living finding the threads other men could only feel. He walked the quarters without raising his voice. He asked about songs. He asked children what names they had heard. He stood near cooking fires and behaved as though smoke interested him. Naomi saw him once in the yard at dusk, his eyes moving not over people but between them. She knew what he was, and she knew he had arrived because Sutter sensed a current under still water. That night, Naomi made the decision she had delayed for years. She could not stay. She also could not use the road she had helped build for others. Not now. Not with Holt listening for exactly that. So she left through a route incomplete enough to be dangerous and separate enough to protect the people behind her. She crossed the first field on her stomach because moonlight had broken through the clouds. She moved through cane, then mud, then black water up to her knees. She carried no written map, only memory, a scrap of cornbread, a small knife, 2 names, 1 direction, north. The journey was not romantic. It was hunger. It was mosquitoes drilling into her neck while she lay flat under brush. It was the need to keep breathing quietly when riders passed close enough for her to smell wet leather. It was cold rain soaking through cotton. It was refusing a path that looked easy because easy paths were where men set traps. It was trusting a woman with a lantern because the song she hummed had one altered line Naomi recognized from the network. It was not trusting a man who smiled too quickly and said the word friend before he had earned it. She moved through Georgia, through South Carolina, across land where every road asked for papers she did not have and every public place could turn into a cage. Sometimes people helped. Sometimes doors stayed closed because terror makes good people small. Naomi did not judge them. Fear was not weakness in that world. Fear was weather. You survived by reading it. By late autumn of 1852, she reached Philadelphia. Not freedom as a clean ending, not safety. Philadelphia had free black churches, vigilance workers, schools, print shops, mutual aid, and rooms where new arrivals could sleep without being named to strangers. It also had kidnappers, slave catchers, courts that could turn a life back into property with documents and lies. Naomi arrived with cracked feet, fever, and no proof of anything except her own living body. But she had what she had always had: memory, discipline, a mind trained by danger, and a refusal that had outlived every person who tried to price it. In Philadelphia, the network had another name: committees, contacts, agents, not safer names, only different ones. The people there had been receiving fugitives from river country for years, sometimes in clusters that seemed to arrive right after plantations fell into legal or financial confusion. They had wondered who was opening those southern doors. They had imagined a man, perhaps. A preacher, a boat captain, a free laborer moving under hired papers. Then Naomi Reed sat in a back room with 3 women from a black church, one tired abolitionist with ink on his cuffs, and an older man who had been waiting for the right question for a decade. She did not tell them everything. A lifetime of caution does not disappear because a door has a latch on the inside. But she told them enough. Enough for the room to go still. Enough for them to understand that the network they had been receiving was not an accident. Enough for them to see that the woman they might have taken for another exhausted arrival had been building routes from inside the teeth of the system. After that, Naomi worked differently. No longer as a body forced through fields and houses. Now as a reader of danger. She helped identify which story sounded true and which had been planted. She taught younger workers how plantation information moved, how panic traveled among enslavers, how a debt notice could matter as much as a patrol road. She listened to new arrivals and asked questions no one else knew to ask. Who opened the north gate? Which overseer courted the widow near the mill? What day did the factor come? Who keeps the passbook? Did the master burn letters or save them? Small questions. Life and death questions. By the mid-1850s, people who never knew Naomi's name were surviving because of patterns she had helped sharpen. Some reached Canada. Some stayed in northern cities and lived under borrowed names. Some were taken. Some disappeared into silences that no network could repair. Naomi kept count as long as counting served the living. Then she stopped. Not because the numbers failed to matter, because every person was more than proof of her work. The legend did not stop. It grew in the South, where truth and need braided into something stronger than exact record. The counting girl. The auction woman. The one they sold and sold, who left accounts opened, overseers ruined, gates unguarded, names missing from morning roll call. The stories made her bolder than she had been. Louder. Almost magical. Naomi would have disliked that. Magic lets people misunderstand labor. What she had done was not magic. It was attention. It was patience sharpened until it could cut. It was the choice to treat every overheard number, every loose nail in a gate, every quarrels between white men, every route, every season, every silence as material. It was the intelligence of a woman the law called property, moving through a world that depended on pretending she had no mind. That was the blindness she used. The men who bought Naomi Reed made the same mistake in different coats. They believed power meant being watched. They believed ownership meant understanding. They believed a person forced to lower her eyes had stopped seeing. They were wrong. Their whole world required them to be wrong. Because if they admitted the full humanity of the people they enslaved, if they admitted the intelligence around them, the memory, the skill, the grief, the love, the strategy, the will, then the lie holding their lives together would begin to rot in their own hands. So they did not see her, and because they did not see her, they left ledgers open. They spoke too freely. They punished symptoms and ignored causes. They guarded doors while she studied hinges. They guarded roads while she studied timing. They guarded bodies while she moved information. That was the thing they never learned. A person can be trapped and still be thinking. A person can be watched and still be watching back. A person can be sold in front of a crowd, priced by strangers, named as property, and still stand there with a mind no one in that yard has permission to enter. Naomi Reed left no monument. No clean official archive carries the whole shape of her. Lives like hers survive in fragments, in testimony, in committee notes, in runaway notices written by enemies, in oral histories, in family stories, in the spaces where the formal record falls silent because it never meant to preserve the truth in the first place. But the truth had other ways to travel. Through women washing clothes at dusk. Through men driving wagons between landings. Through children remembering which names adults lowered their voices to say. Through songs with one line changed. Through people who crossed and lived long enough to tell someone how the door opened. She was 20 years old on that auction platform in Savannah. The auctioneer thought she was calm. The buyers thought she was docile. The man who paid for her thought he had purchased obedience. Naomi was counting, and every number was a crack in the wall.